Ladies and gentlemen, it's such a pleasure for me to have this opportunity to welcome Professor B.F. Skinner to our annual conference and to invite him to speak to us. Professor Skinner's unique contribution to psychology has been sustained over more than 50 years. In this time, he has published many important books whose titles have become prominent features in the psychological landscape: Behavior of Organisms, Science and Human Behavior, Verbal Behavior, The Technology of Teaching, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and of course About Behaviorism. There have also been several anthologies of his papers: Cumulative Record, Contingencies of Reinforcement, of which the subtitle is A Theoretical Analysis, and Reflections on Behaviorism and Society. A recent edition of the journal Behavioral and Brain Sciences was given over to a reprinting of Professor Skinner's seminal papers, together with extensive reviews of those papers by other psychologists. Professor Skinner is also still publishing consistently new papers, as indeed readers of the British Journal of Psychology will shortly see. Perhaps Professor Skinner's major contribution to psychology has been his insistence on the advantages of the analysis of behavior in its environmental context, rather than as an appendage to events occurring at some other level within the organism. I think of him as an explorer. Only recently, a student told me in an essay that Professor Skinner, in his explorations, had discovered the Skinner box. More seriously, his explorations have taken him through the whole range of psychology. Armed with his map of environmental contingencies, he has addressed as wide a range of biological and social phenomena as any living psychologist. Today, Professor Skinner has chosen to talk to us on the topic Cognitive Science and Behaviorism. Professor Skinner.
Thank you, Professor Blackman. I became a member of this society 15 or 20 years ago, I think, but I have not been able to attend the meeting before this. I did manage to hear one paper at one of your Christmas meetings a number of years ago. That's why it is a very special privilege and honor for me to have been asked to address this meeting. Cognitive scientists are in no doubt about the importance of their field. A recent report of a research briefing panel on cognitive science and artificial intelligence claims that the questions to which it addresses itself reflect a single underlying great scientific mystery on a par with understanding the evolution of the universe, the origin of life, or the nature of elementary particles. The rapid growth of the disciplines for which it speaks is said to be advancing our understanding of the nature of mind and the nature of intelligence on a scale that is proving revolutionary. The movement is called a revolution because it is said to have overthrown behaviorism. Behaviorism, says Herbert Simon, was suited to the predominantly positivistic and operationalistic views of the methodology and philosophy of science, and seemed to provide some guarantee against metaphysical, mentalistic explanations of human behavior. The price paid for these qualities was to confine experimental psychology to relatively simple memory and learning experiments, and to a preoccupation with laboratory rats, rather than humans engaged in complex thinking and problem-solving tasks. The discipline that has replaced behaviorism, he said, shows a new sophistication, a new confidence, and a great gain in precision and rigor. But what is cognitive science? What is behaviorism? And what is the difference between them? The old mind-body problem is, of course, one issue. The briefing panel report, let me say, this is in part a criticism of that panel report, which was written by 8 or 10 very prominent cognitive psychologists and artificial intelligence people, was published by the National Science Foundation, and since it was published by the National Academy Press, it is something we can assume that it has the Neil Obstat of the scientific establishment in America. The briefing panel report asks, how can the brain give rise to all the phenomena that we call mental? And how can mind exist in a world totally controlled by physical laws? The more important question concerns the origin of behavior. Cognitive science takes the traditional position. Behavior starts within the organism. We think and then act. We have ideas and then put them into words. We experience feelings and then express them. We intend, decide, and choose to act before acting. Behaviorists, on the other hand, look at antecedent events in the environmental history of the individual and the species. The old stimulus-response formula was an attempt, of course, to give the environment an initiating role, but it has long been abandoned. The environment selects behavior. Ethologists study the contingencies of survival in natural selection that explain species-specific behavior. Contingencies of operant reinforcement select the behavior of the individual in a rather similar way, but of course on a very different time scale. Cognitive scientists clearly make the person an initiator when they adopt the paradigm of information processing, and the adoption is apparently unanimous. As the panel report says, cognitive science and artificial intelligence stand together in taking information processing as the central activity involved in intelligent behavior. Processing information is, of course, something people have done for thousands of years. They have made records of things that happened on clay tiles, papyrus, vellum, paper, magnetic tape, and now silicone chips, and they have stored them and retrieved them and responded to them again, more or less as they responded to the originals. Cognitive scientists have taken this practice as a model or metaphor. Are they justified in doing so? The difference is perhaps best seen in the field of perception. For cognitive science, the direction of action is from organism to environment. The perceiver acts upon the world, perceives it in the sense of taking it in. Perceive comes from a word meaning to capture. It was an important point for Greek philosophers. To know a thing was to be in contact with it. The world had to be taken in and possessed in order to be known. There is some ambiguity in calling perception the processing of information. Are sensory data the information to be processed, or is information extracted from them? The information processing theory of Shannon and Weaver concerned transmission, but processing must have a product. And for cognitive science, that product is, as it was for the Greek philosophers, a representation. We do not see the world, we see copies of it. In a behavioral analysis, the direction is reversed. At issue is not what an organism sees, but how stimuli alter the probability of its behavior. They acquire the power to do so from the part they play in contingencies of phylogenetic and ontogenic selection. What is seen is the presentation, not a representation. There is another step in the cognitive account. The perceiver must retrieve a stored history and in some way fuse it with a current representation. As one psychologist has put it, everyday perception involves assessing and bringing to bear vast stores of knowledge In order to make sense of the fragmentary pattern of light reaching the eye, one must consider many possibilities, make inferences, and formulate and test elaborate hypotheses. Behavioral translation appeals only to the history of reinforcement responsible for the current effect of a presentation. Everyday perception is the product of a vast number of experiences in which fragmentary patterns of light resembling those of the moment in many different ways have been present when behavior has had reinforcing consequences. Cognitive psychologists also contend that the retrieval of stored knowledge affects not only what is seen, but how readily it is seen. Thus, familiar words are seen more readily than rare ones, expected words more readily than unexpected, and decorous words more readily than obscene. A behavioral account explains the same facts as the effects of past consequences, positive and negative. As Broadbent says, nobody disputes the fact that the perception of a word would depend very much upon its probability of occurrence. But there is still a problem for the cognitive psychologist. Broadbent asks, why is it easier to perceive a word which is probable than a word which is improbable? The probability suffices in the behavioral account. A crucial difference between the two positions arises at the final stage. Once a representation has been constructed, what is to be done with it? A molecular biologist, Gunther Stent, traces the processing of visual data, beginning with the roughly 100 million receptor cells in the retina and the roughly 1 million ganglion cells which, according to Stent, process the information coming from them by signaling light, dark, and edge effects. The fibers of the ganglion cells connect the eye with the brain, where the signals converge on a set of cortical nerve cells, which, among other things, process information from fields too big for the ganglion cells. The visual system of the frog abstracts its input data in such a way as to produce only two meaningful structures, my prey and my predator, which in turn evoke either of two alternative motor outputs, attack or flight. But why are meaningful structures needed? Why not simply in a way to produce only two alternative motor outputs? Stent concedes it is not clear at present how far this process of cerebral abstraction by convergence of visual channels can be imagined to go. Should one suppose that the cellular abstraction process goes so far that there exists for every meaningful structure of whose specific recognition a person is capable, for example, my grandmother, at least one particular nerve cell in the brain that responds if and only if the light and dark pattern from which that structure is abstracted appears in its visual space? The primrose path of visual perception leads the cognitive science to a representation and the neurologist to a grandmother cell. But if what happens when one sees one's grandmother is a result of what has happened when one has seen her and persons like her for many times in the past, changes must have taken place in most of the brain. A single point in the brain is needed only to represent a putative, meaningful structure. Stent concludes in the traditional way. No matter how deeply we probe into the visual pathway, in the end we need to posit an inner man who transforms the visual image into a percept. The panel report deals with the last stage rather cavalierly. It says the end product of the analysis of a visual scene is subjectively familiar. We recognize the objects present in the environment and their spatial relations to each other and are able to compute distances in a way that permits us to navigate. Some cognitive touches survive in that statement. Apparently, organisms cannot move about in the world without first computing distances, and things they have seen before are only subjectively familiar. But we presumably means people, not little men in the brain, and objects present in the environment are presumably presentations, not representations, and that is good behaviorism. It cannot be the whole organism that views a representation of reality. It must be some lesser part inside. Cognitive science is forced into saying so when it takes the processing of information as a model. In a behavioral account, the whole organism responds, and it responds to the world around it for reasons which neurology, not cognitive science, will eventually discover. Constructing representations of sensory data is only one kind of information processing. Another kind plays a far more important role in cognitive science. Consider a familiar experiment. In an operant chamber, a hungry rat occasionally presses a lever extending from one wall. When, for the first time, a bit of food is delivered after a single press, the rat eats and then presses the lever more rapidly. That is a simple fact, but cognitive psychologists want to say more about it. They want to say that the rat has learned and now knows that pressing the lever brings food. The statement, pressing the lever brings food, is a description of the apparatus, of the contingencies of reinforcement. In some form or other, it is said to pass into the head of the rat in the form of knowledge, a synonym of cognition. Processing has led not to a representation, but to a rule. There is no evidence that anything of the sort happens in a rat, but what about a person? Given the necessary exposure to a verbal community, a person could certainly say, when I pressed the lever, food appeared. Or, more generally, when the lever is pressed, food appears. People come to know the contingencies in the world around them in that sense. They can describe them. The behavior is verbal and must be analyzed as such. Verbal behavior evidently came into existence when, through a critical step in the evolution of the human species, the vocal musculature became susceptible to operant conditioning. Processes shared with other species were already well established, and they can be used to explain verbal behavior, as I've tried to show in my book. One result is particularly important here. A very large part of the social environment we call a culture consists of descriptions of contingencies of reinforcement in the form of advice, maxims, instructions, rules of conduct, the laws of government and religion, and the laws of science. With their help, members of a group transmit what they have learned to new members, who then behave for either of two reasons. Their behavior is either directly shaped and maintained by the contingencies of reinforcement they are exposed to, or it's controlled by descriptions of such contingencies. When we learn to drive a car, for example, we begin with responses to verbal stimuli. Our behavior is rule-governed. We flip switches, push pedals, and turn the wheel as we are told to do. But consequences follow, and they begin to shape and maintain our behavior. When we have become skillful drivers, the rules no longer function. When contingencies are not adequate, however, we return to the rules. Most of the time, for example, we speak grammatically because of the prevailing contingencies in our verbal community. But when the contingencies are not sufficient, we turn to the rules of grammar. An unnecessary return to rules may be troublesome. When the toad asked the centipede, "Pray, which leg goes after which?" the centipede worked her mind to such a pitch she lay distracted in the ditch, considering how to run. Cognitive scientists argue that rules are in the contingencies and that a person can learn about them in either way. They have therefore felt free to take the easier path and study rule-governed behavior. Settings are often merely described rather than presented. Subjects are asked to imagine themselves in given situations and to say what they would do rather than do it. Contingent consequences are suggested rather than imposed. Assume that if you do A, B will follow. Yet descriptions of settings are never quite accurate or complete. What people say they will do is not always what they actually do. And a description of contingencies, for example, a statement of the odds in a wager, seldom has the same effect as exposure to the contingencies as in repeated betting with those odds. In an experiment on reaction time, for example, the subjects were said to have understood that their task was to depress the response button as quickly as possible following the onset of the signal lights. But how accurately does understanding describe the effect of a history of reinforcement, and how well are contingencies put into effect by saying, respond as quickly as possible? Many years ago, I arranged contingencies under which a pigeon pecked a key as quickly as possible and found reaction times in the human range. I do not believe one can learn how to do so from the cognitive literature. The response to which a reaction time is measured is quite different from pulling the hand away from a painful stimulus, for example, and to understand the difference and give neurologists their proper assignment, the contingencies must be specified. Paving subjects according to their reaction times is a move in the right direction, but only a short one. Perhaps cognitive psychologists do not care why their subjects respond as quickly as possible. A measure of the speed of a cognitive process may be enough. But in the world at large, people behave as quickly as possible for reasons which, for many purposes, need to be understood. Are the contingencies of reinforcement to which a person is exposed stored as representations and rules, or is behavior simply changed by them? When physical records are stored, the records continue to exist until they are retrieved and used. But is that true when people process information? A storage battery would be a better model of a behaving organism. We put electricity into a battery and we take it out, but there is no electricity in the battery. When we put electricity in, we change the battery, and it is a changed battery that puts out electricity when tapped. Organisms do not acquire behavior as a kind of possession. They simply come to behave in various ways. The behavior is not in them at any time. We say that it is emitted, but only as light is emitted from a hot filament. There is no light in the filament. How organisms are changed by contingencies of reinforcement is the field of a behavioral analysis. What is happening inside is a question to be answered by neurology, with its appropriate instruments and methods. Cognitive scientists cannot leave it to neurology because processing information is part of the story they want to tell. As that panel report puts it, a prominent component of artificial intelligence systems is the memory organizations that hold the knowledge and permit finding the right bit of knowledge at the right time. Cognitive scientists presumably appeal to the storage and retrieval of representations and rules because they can then seem to explain behavior by pointing to conditions that are present at the time the behavior occurs. The rat was changed when pressing the lever was reinforced, but it presses now because it knows that pressing brings food. The knowledge is a current surrogate of the history of reinforcement. A classical example of a current surrogate is purpose. We say that we have eyes in order to see, but biologists have long since learned to say only that eyes have evolved because variations which enabled organisms to see better were selected. A similar mistake is made when cognitive psychologists call operant behavior purposive or goal-directed. Features suggesting direction toward a goal are the products of consequences experienced in the past. Cognitive psychologists need current surrogates of histories of selection because they pay little attention to selection as a causal principle. A new discipline, cognitive ethology, makes that mistake. Animals do many complex things. They use tools, lay traps, entice their victims. How can such behavior be explained? Ethologists answer by pointing to contingencies of survival in natural selection. Cognitive ethologists must do so too, to explain features like the growth anatomy of the organism, for which mental processes could scarcely be responsible, but they contend that not all complex behavior can have evolved. Instead, what evolved are said to be mechanisms which enabled animals to have expectations and solve their problems by processing information. Behavior of comparable complexity can, however, be shaped by arranging sequential contingencies of reinforcement, and it is then easier to understand that contingencies of natural selection could have sufficed in phylogenetic instances. Expectation as a current surrogate of a history of reinforcement figures in recent studies of rationality. Herbert Simon calls the elucidation of the concept of rationality one of the crowning achievements of the social sciences in the past 2 or 3 generations. The core of the formal treatment of rationality, he says, is the so-called subjective expected utility theory. According to Simon, human behavior is manifestly directed toward goals and the satisfaction of wants and needs. In behavioral terms, people behave in ways which have had reinforcing consequences, and their susceptibilities, which make those consequences reinforcing, arose through natural selection or conditioning. Wants and needs are current surrogates of a history of deprivation. Simon continues, the rational actor is assumed to have a consistent preference ordering of all possible states of the world. In behavioral terms, reinforcers can be arranged according to their power to reinforce. The axioms of subjective expected utility theory imply that the actor maximizes his or her expected utility in the light of subjective estimates of the probabilities of events. In behavioral terms, people act according to rules which describe or imply contingencies of reinforcement. Missing from the cognitive account is any reference to the effect of the contingencies themselves, apart from the rules derived from them. In a fairly typical experiment, for example, 2 actions having probabilistic outcomes, for example, purchasing 2 kinds of lottery tickets, are described, and the subject is asked to choose between them. As in much cognitive research, by the way, choice is used because a more direct measure of probability of action is lacking. The choice is then compared with what could be called rational in the light of the actual contingencies. But which ticket would the subject actually buy, either after the probabilities were first described to him as rule-governed action, or after he had purchased many, many tickets and consequences had followed? To the extent that economic theory is concerned with what people say they will do, subjective expected utility theory may be adequate. But a behavioral scientist, and one would suppose an entrepreneur or businessman, must be concerned with what they actually do. People most often do those things which have been most abundantly reinforced without making subjective estimates of the probabilities of reinforcement. And the reinforcers are real, not expected. Since contingencies are usually more effective than rules derived from them, we should not be surprised that, as Simon reports, a fair summary of the findings of these experiments is that actual human choices depart radically from those implied by the axioms except in the simplest and most transparent of situations. This does not mean that people are irrational in the sense that contingencies of reinforcement have not been effective. It means that describing contingencies and acting upon the descriptions will not have the same effect as the contingencies themselves. The feelings are among the current surrogates of a history of reinforcement. According to cognitive psychologists, the rat not only learns and hence knows that pressing the lever brings food, it not only expects food to appear when it presses the lever, it feels like pressing the lever. A human subject would say as much. In a behavioral account, what one feels is one's body, and what one feels when one is behaving or likely to behave is therefore a collateral product of the causes of the behavior. It should not be mistaken for the cause. That position is sometimes challenged by asserting that one feeling or state of mind can cause another feeling or state of mind. Jerry Fodor, in a recent article in the Scientific American, contends that mental causes typically give rise to behavioral effects by virtue of their interaction with other mental causes. For example, having a headache causes a disposition to take aspirin only if one also has the desire to get rid of the headache, the belief that aspirin exists, the belief that taking aspirin reduces headaches, and so on. Since mental states interact in generating behavior, it will be necessary to find a construal of psychological explanations that posits mental processes, causal sequences of mental events. It is this construal, says Fodor, that logical behaviorism fails to provide. But what is felt in each case can be construed as either a state of the behaving body or an external controlling variable, and it is they that interact. Consider a simpler example. When one pulls one's hand away from a hot object, must one have a disposition to do so, a desire not to be burned, a belief that the hot object exists, and that a belief that pulling the hand away will terminate the stimulus? Contingencies of survival and natural selection offer a much simpler explanation of that flexion reflex. Contingencies of reinforcement offer a similar explanation of the fact that one turns the steering wheel of a car to avoid a head-on collision. One need not have a belief in the existence of the oncoming car, a desire to avoid collisions, and a belief that turning the wheel will avoid one. Turning the wheel occurs because it has had fairly similar consequences in the past. Neglected contingencies of reinforcement can be very subtle. Kahneman and Tversky have reported that people say they would be less likely to buy a second ticket to the theater if a first had been lost than to buy a ticket after losing the money they had set aside for that purpose. The difference is said to be due to a difference in categorization. The difference in relevant contingencies of reinforcement should not be overlooked. A boy who usually washes his hands before sitting down to dinner quite justly protests when told to wash them if he has already done so. I did wash them. We pay a bus fare and protest if subsequently pressed to do so again. Buying a ticket to the theater is in that category of contingencies. Contingencies involving loss are different. We spoil one sheet of paper and take another, and quite as readily use other money to buy a ticket to the theater. Two writers in a recent issue of The American Psychologist argue that behaviorism must accommodate itself to accepting the importance of what goes on inside the black box, especially since we now have methods for investigating its contents. So what are those methods? Introspection is presumably one of them. An early version of behaviorism, like logical positivism, held that science must confine itself to publicly observable events. But radical behaviorism accepts the fact that parts of our bodies enter into the sensory control of what we do, not only in behavior like figure skating, but in the self-observation that is shaped and maintained by a verbal community. But do we actually observe ourselves extracting information from sensory data, or merely the settings in which we are said to do so? Do we see ourselves storing and retrieving information, or merely the information said to be stored and retrieved? We observe the conditions under which our behavior changes and the changed behavior, but do we see the process of changing? We have more information about ourselves and about other people, but it is only the same kind of information about stimuli, responses, and consequences, some of them internal and in that sense private. We have no sensory nerves going to the parts of the brain that engage in cognitive processes. Brain science also looks into the black box in another way. It has made great progress in discovering both the architecture and the chemistry of the brain. But what can it say about the processing of information? Visual presentations are puzzling enough. What about auditory ones? Do we construct representations while listening to the Emperor Concerto? And how is it stored in the head of the pianist who is playing it? A behavioral account is incomplete, in part because it leaves a great deal to neurology, but at least it avoids the unnecessary problems of storage and retrieval. Cognitive psychologists, like psychoanalysts, observe causal relations between behavior and genetic and personal histories and invent mental apparatuses to explain them. But one may doubt that neurologists, with their very different and much more appropriate techniques of observation, will find anything that resembles them. In confining itself to the facts to which its instruments and methods are suited, behavioral science offers a much clearer statement of its assignment. Simulation is said to be another source of information about the black box. Indeed, the panel report asserts that cognitive science and artificial intelligence stand together not only in taking information processing as the central activity involved in intelligent behavior, but in taking the framework of modern computer science as the foundation for understanding information processing systems. Apart from the advisability of using a framework as a foundation, are we to understand that the study of computers can tell us what we need to know about human behavior? In constructing an artificial organism, that is, a system that exhibits artificial intelligence, one has a choice. One may simulate a nonverbal organism, say a pigeon, and construct a sensory motor system, the behavior which can be selected and strengthened by its consequences. Or one may construct a rule-following system that responds as it is directed to do. The first system would resemble a person who drives the car skillfully because of the way it behaves on the highway. One could study it by arranging contingencies of reinforcement and observing the changes in behavior which follow. It is perhaps natural that those who are concerned with artificial intelligence should choose the rule-following model, resembling a man who drives a car by making only the moves he is told to make. That kind of artificial organism could be instructed to behave in intelligent ways because specialists in artificial intelligence are intelligent, and it could then be credited with intelligence. The first of the two systems could, of course, learn to behave verbally, given the necessary verbal environment, and it would then resemble the second. The second, however, would remain forever simply rule-following. A computer may function as either type of system, but if cognitive scientists have actually, as they say, programmed computers to think creatively and to make scientific discoveries, they have simulated the first type. And they must have known a great deal about it in order to do so, a great deal that cognitive science will not have told them. Linguistics is also said to have illuminated the black box. But most of linguistics is itself an offshoot of an earlier cognitive position. According to the panel report, speakers learn to cope with language, acquire a vocabulary, and master a complex of grammatical rules. Listeners possess a natural language understanding system with which they produce internal representations of the information conveyed by the system and make a semantic analysis of the message conveyed by the language. That is a long way from throwing much light on what speakers and listeners actually do. In the behavioral analysis, meaning is not in what speakers say. It is at best in the personal histories and current settings responsible for their saying it. Meaning for the listener is what the listener does as a result of a different personal history. Rules of grammar describe the contingencies maintained by verbal communities. Languages share universals because they serve universal functions. Nothing is communicated in the sense of transmitted from speaker to listener. Speakers create settings in which listeners respond in given ways. Sentences are generated, but by the contingencies, and only occasionally with the help of rules extracted from them. Only when the contingencies are inadequate do speakers turn to rules. The belief that meanings reside in words is hard to resist. A news commentator recently described the distressing problems some women face just before their periods. It is now known, he said, that these problems are caused by the premenstrual syndrome. But the problems are the syndrome. A similar belief in the power of words could be said to be shown by traditional doctors in a Muslim sect in Nigeria who write an Islamic text on a slate, wash the slate with water, and give the water to their patients as medicine. A curious example of the processing of information. One begins a report of that briefing panel with great expectations, and the confidence and enthusiasm of the panel is typical of the field as a whole. But too many of its sections end with a mere promise. One sub-theme is said to open a research vista that is more than just the hope of increased power, but another is said to be merely pregnant with hope. One field is said to provide a fund of knowledge about possible mechanisms upon which theories of human cognition can be built. Another offers promise of a new burst of progress. Cognitive science is said to be able to provide a broadened theoretical framework within which significant progress can occur. Perhaps we should not ask more from a briefing panel, but what has actually been done that could or would not have been done if the processing information revolution had never happened? Step by step, we may paraphrase the accomplishments of cognitive science in behavioral terms. They have not discovered the form in which information is represented in images. They have discovered some of the ways in which stimuli enter into the control of behavior. They have not discovered how all intelligence arises from the ability to use symbols. At best, they have learned